This meme. This meme is somewhat misleading in my opinion. It is hard to believe that, in a franchise that is so rich with literary references, the whole fanbase struggles with basic text comprehension. Of course, I was a victim of such folly at some times, but it still pictures the fans in an uncultured light. Many of you are not only capable of understanding basic boss mechanics, but also interested in consuming any Project Moon adjacent media. This interest is something that I share, so I've started to get pretty curious about one thing. How much media do you need to get acquainted with in order to completely understand the franchise? Hi, name's Venno, and I'm yet again answering questions that nobody asked. Project Moon games take inspiration from a variety of material. Religion, mythology, fairy tales, made-up stuff. But do you really need to experience them all to understand the lore? Yes, of course you do. Okay, I'm just pulling your leg, but really, how much reference material this dog used to create one of the most rich and compelling dystopian settings? That's what we're about to find out. Today's aim will be to determine all of the books, games, movies, and other material that is connected in some way to the franchise. I will try to compile most of the media that is referenced in the games and official interviews, and provide some evidence as to how exactly they play into the PM-verse as a whole. I'll try to cover as much ground as I can. However, I'm bound to miss something in my research. I encourage you to mention anything missing in this video that is even tangentially referenced by the franchise in the comments below. Also, subscribe, bell, engagement, like, share, 99% of memberships, bye! Even though I'd love to engage my brain rot and pattern recognition on full throttle, I don't think it will be practical to just list every book in existence because they have words read and missed together. We need to somehow differentiate media in terms of relevance and place it in a range from "the games are pretty much based on this" to "one of the ham-ham-pam-pam employees said they liked this book when they were 5 years old." Because of that, I will try to grade everything based on how relevant the material is to the games, the game world, and to the mindset of Project Moon's director and writers. Remember, the grades are my personal opinion and ultimately don't mean anything. Treat them as a tier list kind of swap. One more thing. To keep this video at a reasonable length, and to keep my sanity, I generally won't go into much detail on the material that will be mentioned. I might, if I feel like it, but don't rely on the PNG doc to provide accurate literary analysis. And spoilers for the entire franchise, in case you were wondering. Okay, hope you got all that, because we're diving headfirst into the books. What's the deal with the weird names here? And the facility is looking funny? What is a Clythot? Well, I'm glad you asked. LoveCorp is not exactly subtle with its representation of Jewish mysticism. Some of the more obvious aspects would be the structure of the facility itself, that is based on the inverted Kabbalistic tree of life, and the names of the Sephiroth. Parts of their personalities and duties can be inferred from what their respective nodes represent on the tree of life, like how Malkuth means kingdom and is the Sephira of the control team, or how Bina translates to intelligence or wisdom, and goes off on philosophical yapping sessions with the manager. It's difficult to name a singular book that would encompass everything that pertains to the specific parts of the Kabbalah that were taken into the franchise, but if I had to name one, it would probably be Sefer Yetzirah, or the Book of Formation. It is the book that constitutes the symbolic foundation of the whole franchise, so I suggest you get somewhat acquainted with it. Other books that may be relevant are the Tanakh, or the Hebrew Bible, the Zohar, and the Book of Enoch, all essential Jewish texts. However, I doubt whether they directly influenced the franchise in any meaningful way that wasn't already done by Sefer Yetzirah. Some people also know the text Hekel Atrabari, though the only relevance I could note is that the first name that is written there is Ishmael, so take of that what you will. Alright, come on out, we've all been expecting you. How can the Bible not be mentioned in such a literary heavy franchise? You might as well bring out your rejected cousin while we're at it. Several abnormalities are directly based on Christianity, particularly the Old Testament part of the Bible. Some plot beats too, if you believe a certain letter to be the Antichrist. There are also several characters like Malkuth, Yesod, Hesed, and others who are prominent characters in the Old Testament. Or should I say Elijah, Gabriel, Daniel, Daniel especially, since several stories in the Apocrypha also feature him, those being Greek additions to the Book of Daniel. There may be other Christian texts that reference other characters like Book of Ezra or Book of Esther and whatnot, but those texts' relevance is so minuscule in my opinion that they don't really count. Now, if we were to look for an inspiration behind the city itself, then that would most likely be The Republic by Plato. And 1984 by George Orwell, I guess. Got any sources for that? No, but we can make several inferences. The city that was described by Socrates in the dialogue represents a perfect state that embodies the ideals of a just society, both politically and ethically, on collective and personal scales, that achieves harmony and happiness through exercising justice within the person's self. Or something like that. The main giveaway for me though was Socrates mentioning literature and how imitating human behavior through this medium would be strictly forbidden. Sounds a lot like the Artificial Intelligence Ethics Amendment, which outlaws any AI with human-level sapience within the city. Also, terms from 1984 were dropped in Millie's song Salt, Pepper, Birds and Thought Police, which is featured in the dedicated Runa album to Kill a Living Book. So there's that piece of evidence. And the book is pretty much the quintessential dystopian classic, so I would be surprised if it wasn't somehow involved, considering the amount of literary references in the franchise. Moving slowly into the Runa section, we have Library of Babel by, oh my god, I'm gonna butcher this, Jorge Luis Borges. The one true book, so to say. The game was to be originally called Library of Babel, as seen in the true ending of WoW, but it was changed to Library of Runa, probably to reflect how every person that comes to the library meets their rune, or maybe how the library itself was made of runes in the facility. On a side note, I always thought that the Silent Orchestra was kind of like a bridge between the two games, considering how it references the themes of rune and music, and is eerily similar to The Pianist, both in how dangerous they are and that they share the theme of music. Thank you, Roland, for the segue. Let's discuss your books now. Those will be Orlando Inamorado and Orlando Furioso, as well as Son of Roland, the original source of the character Orlando. However, the former two books more closely follow his relationship with Angelica in Argalia, which fits the game more, so they're going to be more relevant. As for the second protagonist of the game, Angela, she doesn't really have a source book, but I would guess that To Android's Dream of Electric Sheep by Philip K. Dick may be a decent placeholder, since it does talk about several themes that are pertinent to the world of Project Moon, like alienation, artificiality, and consumerism. I understand that just throwing a single book onto Angela and calling it the inspiration behind her may be a disservice to her magnificently written character. But this book will be referenced anyway in several Millie songs and an Abnormality from Limbus, so I've got to get it out of the way since it at least loosely fits. Another notable literary inspiration for the game is possibly Stephen King's The Jaunt. In the story, humanity developed an instant transportation method known as the Jaunt, which a human mind might experience only while unconscious, or else suffer horrific consequences. In Runa, this idea is expanded upon in the event that shall not be named, by making most of the passengers experience the nigh endless passage of time while awake, when the first-class passengers are put in stasis and never get exposed to the horrors of the train. And lastly for Runa, arguably its most important inspiration, is a collection of poems Sky, Wind, Stars and Poem by a Korean poet Yoon Dong-ju. Now you can immediately notice the naming parallel both in Runa's subtitle and one of the aforementioned Millie songs, but it's apparent that the similarities don't end there. The song's lyrics paint a picture of a peaceful life that had been abruptly taken away by an invading oppressor who forces a different way of living onto the unfortunate. However, the singer refuses to give up hope and writes poems as an act of rebellion against the attempts to raise the culture and overall existence. It is entirely based on the life of Dong-ju, as well as the lives of numerous Koreans under Japanese rule, which lasted from 1910 until the end of World War II. The treatment of non-humans in Project Moon City is similar to how Koreans were treated during this time period. You can draw a lot of similarities between the historical events that led to the creation of the poems and the exploitative, hyper-corporate culture of the setting, but I'm here to provide a reading list, not a history lesson, so you can read up on the books and draw your own conclusions. Oh, Limbus. Limbus. Let's get this out of the way. The centers are directly based on their literary counterparts, with some changes to their backstories, personalities, and gender. It's pretty obvious, and I don't think I need to explain why. One thing I will say is that Gregor's and Rodian's books are represented in a really weak way. And while I understand it in Canto 1's case, since my beloved Bug Guy's book is pretty short, Canto 2... I'd argue the most important Sinner book to read would be Crime and Punishment, since we won't get a faithful Limbus representation of it, unless they decide to rewrite Canto 2, or heavily add onto Rodian's story in an interval or such. Kinda like Time Kill and Time did, but in a way more substantial fashion. One Sinner book I'll have to separately mention is Divine Comedy by Dante Alighieri. The whole game is following the main character's journey through the Inferno, being led by their trusty guide Virgilius and going through the circles of hell that correspond to sins committed by the sinners residing there. Sounds familiar? The game heavily relies on a poem structure, even more so than other games before it that relied on their foundational pieces. Reading the book would also provide valuable insight into the potential overall future of this live service narrative. Not that this isn't true for the other upcoming Sinner stories. Now, on the more miscellaneous side, we have The Little Prince, as its quotes are spoken by Damien from time to time, the Bible again with the marks of Cain, the Cow screenplay from Free Place by Yu Qijin, as the inspiration behind Don Rang and his story, The Stars by Alphonse Daudet, as the source for the characters of Alfonso, Stephanette, and the story in Canto 4 about the tearful thing, and works of Agatha Christie, since Honwu reads a book throughout the Time Kill and Time interval by an author named Agatha. As for a particular book? Let's take Murder on the Oriental Express, since that may have been the inspiration for the subsequent interval. I mean, come on. And that's it for the book inspirations behind the games. Phew, sorry if I started rushing towards the end there. As you can see by the length of the video, this is taking me a long time, and the analyses deserve their own videos anyway. Now the tedious part, the abnormalities. I'll cover most, if not all of them, mentioning any possible sources. These may be books, movies, games, myths, folktales, whatever. For the sake of completion, even if it doesn't contribute to the reading list, I'll name all the abnormalities that have any kind of reference anyway. Okay, here we go. Skip to a timestamp in the description if you're not interested. Scourged Girl is a reference to a short story named The Little Match Girl by Hans Christian Andersen, about a poor girl trying to sell matches on a cold New Year's Eve. I don't remember how her exploding counts into the story though. One sin and hundreds of good deeds is obviously a reference in Jesus, when you look at the thorn crown and the cross. And let's get the Bible mostly out of the way here. Plague Doctor is akin to a messiah-like figure, best in employees, while White Knight is pretty much Lucifer, according to in-game files from the legacy version of WobCorp. Or it could be Jesus with their 12 apostles deal, but then is one sin Adam? Because, you know, the original sin? Whatever. Another thing is that White Knight's ego weapon, Paradise Lost, is a reference to the poem of the same name by John Milton, which is a retelling of the story of Adam and Eve, so that fits. The Magical Girl Quartet is pretty much a direct reference to the Mahou Shoujo, or magical girl genre, of Japanese fantasy media, particularly of the depressing variety, popularized by Puella Magi Madoka Magica. Interestingly, each magical girl corresponds to a certain card suit, Queen of Hatred being hearts, Knight of Despair spades, King of Greed diamonds, and Servant of Wrath clubs. At least that's how I interpret it. Oh, and also Jester of Neo being, well, the Jester card, and also the Fool card from the Major Arcana of Tarot cards. Of more trivial note is that one of Queen of Hatred's attacks is called Arcana Slave, which is potentially a reference to an attack called Dragon Slave from a light novel Slayers by Hajime Kanzaka. King of Greed's design is pretty much based on Portrait of Adele Bloch Bao I. I'm not gonna redo this one. Also called The Lady in Gold or The Woman in Gold by Gustav Klimt. The opening quote when you choose King of Greed during Abnormality extraction is also a reference to a poem in Friedrich Nietzsche's Thus Spoke Zarathustra, called The Midnight Song. The quote reads, "Deep is the sorrow of the world, greed deeper still than agony. Sadness says, begone, pass away, but greed seeks eternity, seeks deep, deep eternity." The red shoes is another Hans Christian Andersen reference. In a story of the same name, a girl obsesses over a pair of shoes, who ends up under a curse where she has to dance as long as she wears the shoes. She ends up cutting her feet off, but the shoes still dance anyway with the feet in them. Ouch. The lady facing the wall might be a reference to the legend of Orpheus and Eurydice, according to the name of her special ability in Legacy version. In the legend, during their escape from the underworld, Hades let the pair of lovers go, but on one condition. Orpheus must not look back at Eurydice until reaching the surface. However, when they were almost at the end, he looked back and lost her once again, after which he joined her again only after his death. Nothing there probably takes inspiration from the monster of the movie The Thing, 1982, from the director John Carpenter, in which an extraterrestrial creature tries to kill the characters by assimilating and completely replicating them. The eagle weapon Mimicry bears resemblance to the Soul Edge weapon from the Soul Calibur series, as well as the blade arm from Prototype. Okay, I'm gonna lump them together here. Warm-hearted woodsman, Scarecrow searching for wisdom, Scaredy Cat, The Road Home, Ozma, and The Adult Who Tells Lies, also known as False Throne, are based on characters from The Wonderful Wizard of Oz and its sequel, The Marvelous Land of Oz. Particularly, Ozma is from the second book. Had to double check that since I didn't even know there was a sequel book and was confused when the Abner popped up as one of the fights in Bruna. The more you know. The Snow Queen is based on a fairy tale of the same name by Hans Christian Andersen. Although I'm not sure if in the story there was a sword fight against the queen, so maybe this Abner references another version of the story. Snow White's apple is a reference to the German fairy tale Snow White by Brothers Grimm. The fact that the apple became an Abno may be due to the fact that in many stories that take direct inspiration from Snow White, the apple is often replaced with other objects like flowers or thorns, proving the apple to be nothing more than a replaceable plot device. The apple ultimately becomes a self-proclaimed princess according to the Abnologue, so good for it I guess. Beauty and the Beast is based on a fairy tale of the same name written by the French novelist Gabrielle Suzanne Barbeau de Villeneuve. I hope that's correct. How did they manage to come up with such a hideous design? I do not wish to know. Queen Bee may be referencing the Chessburst scene from Alien, 1979. Open can of Welchers. There are two parts to it that are worth noting. The first is that it is based on a real brand of soft drink called Welch. There exists an urban myth where a person may get abducted due to them drinking an open can of Welch juice laced with sleeping pills and then brought onto a fishing boat. The second part is the portrait of the Abnormality is based on a 90s Korean ad for a coffee named Latte. The ad is eccentric, and the water luckily matches the boat motif. Imagine being kidnapped by these guys. Well, I won't mind it if I get a magical girl transformation as part of the employment benefits. Alraune is the name of a German novel by Hans Heinz Evers, which was based on a practice from Middle Ages. It was believed by alchemists that mandrakes, or Alraunen in German, were produced after the earth absorbs the sperm of hanged men, which was interpreted as the soil accepting their last strengths. The resulting fruit and root were used as ingredients to increase fertility and brew love potions. Okay, I don't know how that relates to the abnormality itself, and I don't want to know. Next. The punishing bird seems to be sort of a combination of two bird species, the bleeding heart doe and Shima Inaga. Cute. Little Red Riding Hood and Big and Will Be Bad Wolf are, of course, based on the folk fairy tale Little Red Riding Hood. In this case, I will cite the Brothers Grimm version. The awesome thing about them is that, well, they are an awesome rival duo, but also that Little Red's design was at least partially based off of Bloodborne, which is fucking awesome. It now confirms that LoveCorp truly is the Dark Souls of management sims. The Little Prince is the name of a novella written by Antoine de Saint-Exupéry, which is also the name of the abnormality. The Abnologue mentions a certain employee bearing a birthmark on their forehead. Now, I doubt they foreshadowed the mark of Cain this early, but it is cool to find such a connection when the games are only 5 years apart. Wow, I thought LoveCorp released much earlier. It felt like an eternity to me. Damn. Letitia derives her name from the Roman goddess of happiness and gaiety. Don't know how that relates to her gifting you a gun. Der Freischütz is pretty much entirely based off of a German folktale about a marksman, or a free shooter, which was widely circulated after it being included in the first volume of Gespensterbuch by August Appel and Friedrich Lahn. The Abnormality pretty much borrows the myth wholesale, since I haven't noticed any additions to its lore, aside from the folktale itself. Dream of a Black Swan takes inspiration from a German fairy tale, The Six Swans, that also featured in Grimm's Fairy Tales of 1812. I do think, however, that the Abnologue might be also referencing The Ugly Duckling by Hans Christian Andersen, since some mentions of the fairy tale might be better suited to that fairy tale rather than The Six Swans. It is my own uneducated guess and should be taken with a spoonful of salt, since
I made it the fuck up.
Mountain of Smiling Bodies bears some resemblance to No Face from Spirited Away, specifically they are rampaging form, and That Stench Most Foul boss from Salt and Sanctuary, the latter one most likely being coincidental. Giant Tree Sap might be based off of Yggdrasil, an enormous tree that connects the 9 worlds in Norse mythology. Parasite Tree's game file in the English version of WobCorp is also named Yggdrasil, and it gives an ego gift that resembles elf ears. I guess I'd put it added to the reading list, why not? Fairies are a common part of European folklore, being often depicted as either kind, whimsical, or mischievous. Fairy Festival in particular seems to be more on the side of top 10 fairy tale creatures that will brutally murder you. However, a more concrete reference would come from a Wonderlap aberration named Titania, who is the Queen of Fairies in William Shakespeare's play A Midsummer Night's Dream, which also features her husband, Oberon, whom she seeks during her breach in the comic. Portrait of Another World could be a reference to Oscar Wilde's The Picture of Dorian Gray. Today's Shy Look shares some aspects with Shy Guys from the Super Mario Bros. Series, like their names and faces, but this is probably, no, most certainly a coincidence. Just look at this fella, does he look like he would hurt a fly? Okay, let me share with you a little theory regarding Blue Star. I think this is yet another biblical reference, particularly regarding the Star of Bethlehem, or the Christmas star, that led the Magi to the birthplace of Jesus Christ. Considering the religious undertones and how it is the third Abnormality fight on Hawkma's floor in Runa, right before White Knight, there are some grounds to it, I think. You can probably link it to some another celestial body, since we already have 2 obvious Bible Abnos, but still it's something that I want to share. Old Faith and Promise is referencing Kim Ji-hoon's crippling gambling addiction and the inevitable conception of Limbus Company, as well as an equipment upgrade system in Dungeon Fighter Online, where reinforcing a piece of gear would either result in an increase in its stats, a decrease, or complete destruction of the equipment piece. The Abno derived its name from an item called Kiri's Promise that would prevent the unfavorable outcomes of reinforcement. This system would go on to be implemented in many Eastern online games, mainly MMORPGs. So, I guess keep gambling, my dudes. Porcubus is alluding to drugs, or rather to opium poppies, which are used to produce opium. Thus, the Abno might be related to the Chinese Opium Wars, but it's more likely just a general representation of drug addiction. Its name is also probably a combination of porcupine and succubus, which is fitting, but I'm not sure if that references anything in particular. Void Dream is based on a Japanese mythological creature known as Baku, which would come into your room and eat your nightmares while you sleep. I also just noticed that it is meant to be both a sheep and a rooster, which is really cool. Void Dream, as well as Grave of Cherry Blossoms, were made by the Japanese translation team for WobCorp. By the way, Grave of Cherry Blossoms is based on a cherry tree, who would have guessed. However, because of that, it's somewhat difficult to pinpoint the exact inspiration behind the Abno. There are several suspects. First one, Yoboko, a yokai tree that thrives on battlefields where there's lots of human blood to drink. Second suspect, Under the Cherry Trees by Motojiro Kaiji, who famously wrote, "There are dead bodies buried under the cherry trees," which is the reason given as to why the cherry blossoms flower that beautifully. Third suspect, the Saigyo Ayakashi from Toku Project, which also lures people to their deaths so that may consume them. Fourth suspect, a reference to cherry blossoms being a motivation for Japanese pilots who engaged in, let's say, mutually assured destruction with the enemy. I'm picking the Tohu option, since Tohu 7 is my favorite one. Firebird is pretty much based on the Slavic analog of a Greek myth of the phoenix, which in the Eastern Slavic folktales went by the name of Jar Pizza, which almost literally translates to Firebird. This abnormality was contributed for the game by the Russian translation team. By the way, the Russian Project Movie is, weirdly enough, the most comprehensive out of all of them, since I've been finding information in it that is not featured anywhere else. Thanks to the extremely brain-rotted individuals that run things there, you've been a great help. Yin and Yang were contributed by the Chinese translation team, and are obviously based on Yin and Yang, so I don't need to explain this one, I hope. Il pianto della luna is Italian for the lament of the moon. When being worked on, the abnormality plays the first movement of Beethoven's Moonlight Sonata. While breaching, it plays the third movement. It also used to be called by its Spanish name El Llanto de la Luna in the Legacy version, but was changed to Italian for consistency's sake. The breaching form of Clouded Monk resembles that of a preda, a spirit in Buddhist mythology that is suffering due to numerous punishments for its misdeeds when it was mortal. Such spirits were callous individuals who are now subjected to supernatural hunger, thirst, cold, and heat. The most awesome abnormality, Bald is Awesome, references Bruce Willis and The Rock of all people. Bruce Willis because the flavor text name drops him, and The Rock because the Eagle Weapon is a reference to the character he portrays in the Fast and Furious franchise. Never would I imagine that you need to watch the freaking Fast and Furious films to understand PM lore, but here we are. Nosferatu is based on the whole idea of vampires in European folklore, who are called blood fiends in the games. While they are quite different from their bloodsucking inspiration, they are pretty much vampires, yeah. The modern interpretation of the myth can be read in the short prose The Vampire by John William Polidori, or experienced in any of the numerous pieces of vampire media. Haha, Hichun, you're banging my daughter. Price of Silence represents another major arcana card of the tarot deck, that being 13, Death. The way it refers to Hawkmane in particular is that the card symbolizes change and how a major phase of someone's life is ending while another one begins. A person needs to put their past behind them so that they can move forward. The reversed version of death means stubbornness, refusal to change, and stagnation. Overcoming your dread of the unknown possibilities lets you face the fear, breaking the cycle. Damn, such a cool abnormality. Why was it even removed from the Warp Corp? Pinocchio references Pinocchio from the Adventures of Pinocchio by Carlo Collodi, where a marionette Pinocchio wants to become a boy Pinocchio. The Abno leans more towards the wise and mere imitation of being a human, rather than learning and internalizing actual values that constitute a human. Doomsday Calendar's design is inspired by an Aztecan solar calendar. Contrary to popular belief, the Sunstone didn't function as an actual calendar, but more of a cultural symbol and ritualistic object that referred to cosmic cycles. The Abno's purpose is depicted through the ritualistic Claydol sacrifices, while the Universe of Flame skill might be alluding to the actual apocalypse, probably the one that was supposed to happen in the year 2012. Shame it's running a bit late though. Golden apples were used all throughout various legends as a reward or MacGuffin to be retrieved by a hero. The Limbus version, however, may be closer to the Apple of Discord that was dropped by Ares at the wedding of Peleus and Thetis, which led to the Trojan War. But I don't remember it killing anyone by itself, so the connection is admittedly somewhat tenuous. Baba Yaga borrows its name from the ferocious-looking old witch that eats children and flies in a big wooden mortar. The body of the abnormality, though, is the witch's hut that stands on chicken legs. Her first literary appearance would be in Mikhail Lomonosov's book Russian Grammar, but you can also see her in a large number of Slavic fairy tales as a secondary character or antagonist. Yaga usually isn't portrayed as an ice witch, but Rodian's story and Russia's general cold climate might have contributed to this slight change in representation. My Form Empties is based on a Heart Sutra of Buddhist mythology, though a more novelized inspiration would be Journey to the West's Sutra Tripitaka, a collection of ancient scriptures that the protagonist of the story, Sun Wukong, has to collect. A monk who accompanies the hero, Tang Sen Tang, is also attributed to the moniker of Tripitaka, since it's his mission to seek the sutras. He is probably the Buddha that is depicted by the Abnormality, because, spoiler alert, at the end of the novel he is appointed as the Buddha of Sandalwood. It is also worth noting that the ego of the Abno translates roughly to the form of emptiness, which refers to the concepts of sunyata, or vacuity in Buddhism. Drifting fox might be referring to the Korean folktale of sun showers, or fox rain, which occurs when a tiger marries a fox. The rain comes from a cloud that was in love with the fox and, due to being cucked, weeps upon seeing the wedding because it cannot bear the pain of unrequited love. I guess the rain is toxic or made out of undiluted K-Corp tears in the Limbus version? Brazen bowl is based on a torture method used in ancient Greece. A person was placed inside the bowl and then cooked alive by lighting a fire underneath the bowl. The design was such that the screams from inside the device would sound like bellows of a bow, and the steam that forms inside would come out of its nostrils. It seemed that the animal came to life during every execution. Fairy Gentleman and Fairy Longlegs are seemingly related to each other and to Fairy Festival, and by extension to Titania and general European folklore, but most of it is kind of speculation. I do want to note, however, that the harmful rain featured in Fairy Longlegs' Abno Choice event might be connected to K-Corp tears and Drifting Fox, though that is also a theory. A Limbus theory. So that no one will cry's talismans closely resemble the Fulu Taoist talismans. Sorry to interrupt again, but during my research I somehow mixed up the Chinese and Korean symbols. The proper origin would be the Korean Buddha, and the alternatives would be the Japanese Hofuda and the Chinese Fulu. I do not know how that happened. I'm gonna chalk it up to being freaking tired during writing all of this. Sorry. Headless Ichthys is another Bible reference corresponding to the Ichthys symbol in early Christianity that, indeed, looked like a fish. Symbolically, the word was kind of an acronym that meant Jesus Christ, God's Son, Savior. So this is like, what, the 4th Jesus candidates so far? A freaking fish? God. 400... I almost said cigarettes. 400 Roses makes several references to a novel Carmilla by Sheridan Le Fanu. Its two ego gifts being names which the titular female vampire went by. Rose Hunter represents the huntsman that was sent to kill Snow White by the evil queen. Oh, and the queen is Ebony Queen's Apple, forgot to mention that. CPM, that's how forgettable Limbus's first wall class is. Please buff. Spiral of Contempt may represent some sort of religious concept. The clasped hands being brought upwards, the golden motifs common in religious structures. There is something, but not enough to link it to something concrete, and there are other details that potentially contradict my observations. This is one of the coolest Abno designs PM made, so I'm encouraging here some discussion about it. Ardor Blossom Moth might be related to an Irish myth about Dilan Day, or magical flames appearing in a Beltane balefire during celebrations. But it's more likely that the idea for the abnormality came directly from the phrase, like moths to a flame, especially considering that Faust's LCE ego has a rather self-destructive tendency to combust. Fey Lantern, another fairy-adjacent abnormality that references Shakespeare's A Midsummer Night's Dream with its ego gift. Maybe it's also connected to Fairy Festival? At this point we could consider them like a whole set of fairy creatures. Dreaming Electric Sheep almost name drops the novel it is based on, which is Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep? If these sheep are anything like this boss, then no, they don't, if they know what's good for them. Skin Prophet mentions two Bible verses, specifically Isaiah 9:2 and Isaiah 6:5. As to how they relate, here's a GIF instead. Sign of Roses has a lot of Christian imagery in its design. The diagonal post looks like one that Saint Andrew was crucified on, and the ego gift is a crown of thorns that is akin to the one worn by Jesus. King in Binds, in his skill animation, Present Thyself Before the King, brings down a giant sword that is hanging by a piece of fabric. This is reminiscent of a story about the Sword of Damocles, in which the king Dionysus exchanged places with his courtier, Damocles, and let him sit on the throne for one day while ordering to hang a sword by a horse's hair right above the man. Cicero, a Roman narrator, later committed the anecdote to this book series, Tusculani Disputationes, after which it entered the cultural mainstream. The fanbase kinda believes that there may be some through line between old refraction railroad wall abnormalities, but I don't really see it. Nymph, Centaur, Hydra, and Cyclops are a set of hospital-themed abnormalities that take their names from Greek mythological creatures. The reason why they're Greek and in the hospital may have to do with the staff caduceus, which is recognized as a symbol of healthcare. Otis also has the symbol in her eagle art, by the way. White Knight's eagle weapon, Paradise Lost, is also similar to the staff of Asclepius, who is the Greek god of medicine, while caduceus was the staff of Hermes and originally represented trades and everything associated with the trickster god. It's all very confusing when trying to dig into it. Oh, and also some of the abnormal designs are reminiscent of Silent Hill enemies. Monkey Tree resembles a dead tree in a desert, maybe of a particular biological species. However, this is yet another Divine Comedy reference. In the middle ring of the seventh circle of hell, Violence, Dante sees a barren field of dead trees and bushes, who are the transformed souls of those that took their own life. Virgilius even instructs Dante to snap one of the branches to confirm this, after which the tree screams in pain. Why is the gift called Thunderbranch? Probably because trees have a tendency to catch lightning and become dead just like the Abno. Perhaps the lightning is some kind of divine punishment, casting the soul into the inferno. Or maybe I'm reading too much into this and I'm just a dumbass. Hole in the Man may be a reference to a French existentialist play No Exit by Jean-Paul Sartre. In it, a character named Estelle has a relationship with a man who shot himself in the head due to her actions. Later in Hell, Estelle mistakes the man with another character, Garson, who she accuses of hiding a hole in his head. The ego gift also is of some relevance, since Garson at some point reminisces about his wife holding his coat that is riddled with bullets. Spider of Marriage has an ego gift, Prejudice, that, considering the pride affinity of it, may be a small nod towards an English novel by Jane Austen, Pride and Prejudice. Smoky Old Man's ego gift, Homeward, features a faded picture that is eerily similar to the battle background against the road home in Runa. Perhaps he is somehow related to the Wizard of Oz? By the way, I like to think that Old Lady from LoveCorp is also related to the Old Man, since they are both explicitly called old and maybe they used to keep each other company at some point. Pagoda Veneration's ego, Wishing Cairn, specifically the one Yisang uses, has a passive that name drops the exact inspiration behind the Abno, namely Dol Harabong statues on Jeju Island in Korea. The act of placing stones on top of one another is a Korean tradition. Cairns are formed by passers-by along trails, roadsides, and on mountaintops. When hikers successfully add a stone without toppling the cairn over, they hope that they've appeased the mountain spirit, or San Shin, and that it will bring them good luck. Time Duck in its Mirror Dungeon event references the duck-rabbit illusion, where the observer can see either the ears of a rabbit or the beak of a duck. The fact that the design of the Abno consists of melted clockwork might be somewhat similar to Salvador Dali's piece The Persistence of Memory. The ego name Everlasting can be somewhat synonymous with persistent after all. Dimensional Orbit Stabilizer's ego gift, Disk Fragment, appears to be similar to a piece of a Nebra sky disk that was uncovered in Nebra, Germany. Apparently, it is one of the oldest depictions of the cosmos and might have been used as an astronomical calculation tool to determine planting and harvesting times. Apparently, Funeral of a Dying Butterfly is based on Korean overworked salarymen, or guraso, who fly away after not getting the job they've applied for. Fly away being a metaphor for unaliving themselves. Now, the wiki states this, but I could not fact check it, so take it with a grain of salt, please. Broken Wings bears resemblance to the sculpture Winged Victory depicting the goddess of victory, Nike. Now that's a crossover I wouldn't mind seeing. Resident of Metropolaris is 2 syllables away from plagiarizing the film Metropolis by Fritz Lang. The design of the Abno's head is also somewhat similar to the designs in the movie, though my mind immediately jumped to those guys from the movie Robots. Basili Soup is based on a European folk story about a stone soup, where a group of travelers places a stone into a pot and claims to the peasant villagers that they are cooking a stone soup. The villagers decide to make the soup actually tasty by throwing in actual ingredients. In the end, the travelers take out the stone and enjoy the soup together with the villagers. The basilisk is probably the stone part of the soup, since in some interpretations of the mythical creature, it has a gaze that can turn anyone into a statue. Alright, that's it. The end of Abnormalities. Holy hell. Should have probably cut down them to only specific book references, but whatever. Now, here comes the actually interesting part, because there's no more book reading going forward. Yippee! We're going to comb through all the interviews now, and find the media that inspired Kim Ji-hoon personally. Most of these are games and movies, and also books, but we've already mentioned most of them previously. Again, thanks to the Russian wiki that compiled all interviews so that I could find them in one Google search. We're gonna start with the most recent one, and then grab other references from the more older ones. The first interview is conducted by Daichi Saito of Needy Streamer Overload fame and Jinny, the manager of the game review media outlet Game Seminar, both forming Indie Intelligence Network, a journalist organization that focuses on talking with indie developers and distributing their insights to others who may need it. Apparently in their introductory paragraph, the article describes Project Moon as revolutionary heroes of the Korean game industry. Well, anyway, when asked what events led him to become a game developer, Kim Ji-hoon states that his gaming journey started with games like Counter-Strike and Half-Life, with the latter being a big influence apparently. Then he hits us with a whole pile of Japanese media, first being Neon Genesis Evangelion, then Gurren Lagann, which spurred him to watch even more. The Melancholy of Haruhi Suzumiya, The Familiar of Zero, Lucky Star. Then he moves into dramas like Bambino, Train Man, and Boys Over Flowers. Despite Gurren Lagann being what got him into anime, the slice of life genre was closer to his tastes. His preferences also applied to games like the JRPG Tales of Destiny, which featured solid dialogue and character interactions. After that, Kim names his top 3 favorite books, those being Damien, The Stranger, and Norwegian Wood by Haruki Murakami. Yes, I lied about there being no more books. But this one is interesting, since if you're somewhat familiar with its contents, the themes it represents don't really feature in any Project Moon's works. Well, I digress. A little later in the interview, Kim was asked why the setting was created the way it was, filled with hatred and injustice. He then answers that it's how he views the world, because he himself is riddled with distrust and anxiety. When constructing the city, he was partly inspired by the works of Jorge Luis Borges, I'm not gonna read his name, whose Library of Babel was already mentioned in the video. That's how he learned to build worlds of magical realism. Next, Kim Ji-hoon describes the media that directly led him to the creation of the franchise, starting with Arcturus, the Curse and Loss of Divinity, stating its plot twist in the middle of the story. While I couldn't find the exact moment he was talking about, I can say that the game was impressive at the time because of its focus on a complex and intriguing story, especially considering how dark it gets in the latter half. The gameplay also features a blend of turn-based and real-time battles, which really reminded me of Runa, and especially Runa's legacy builds on Project Moon's YouTube channel. Lee Yumi, a founding member of Project Moon, and she's also kinda there in the interview, mentions that Kim Ji-hoon manages his company like an absolute monarch and likens him to From Software's CEO Hidetaka Miyazaki. Kim even mentions later in the interview that he played Elden Ring and is really looking forward to the DLC. When interviewers asked about regional appeal, Kim mentioned Adventure Time as one of the inspirations for the art style at the start of LobCorp's development. However, the style later changed to resemble more of an anime look, since it fitted more with his creative sense. Lastly, during the development of Library of Runa, Kim recommended his employees a board game to play every week in order for them to observe the game's designs and better understand them. This is due to the fact that he created a tabletop game called Library of Babel during his student years, which is why he loves the genre to this day. The interview by itself has tons of insight into the director's life and his thought process behind the franchise, which deserves a video all on its own, but we gotta keep moving. Next is the TGS 2022 interview with IGN Japan. Note that I'll be using Google Translate for this, so some statements may be slightly inaccurate. There are several mentions of SCP Foundation as being the main inspiration behind Lobotomy Corporation. Kim Ji-hoon just wanted to play a monster management sim and didn't find one, so he decided to make his own. Also, yes, I finally mentioned SCP as one of the main inspirations for the series. You can stop yelling at me. After that, Kim explains why Library of Ruina has its real-time battle simulation, as he calls it. The main inspirations for it were the gameplay of the Uncharted Waters series, as well as Romance of Three Kingdoms, or Sangokushi in Japan. And the last mention in the interview would be of a mobile rhythm game, Cyrus, inside of which PM employees would find Millie and their music, after which they probably contacted the group to make a couple of songs for LR. Okay, the original page for this interview is not even linked anywhere, so I had to dig a little. This is a 2021 GameMecca.com interview with Kim Ji-hoon and Lee Yumi, conducted by Lee Saibyok, the voice actress for Leslie. Okay, I guess she had an article writing gig or something. Anyway, this interview was prompted by a 2 billion won investment into Project Moon that was made by a Korean mobile game company, Dep Sisters. It mostly focuses on the reasons behind PM's financial and artistic decisions and how they played into the modern otaku market. The first mention of a different game is actually made by Lee Yumi, that being Dungeon Fighter Online. It was her first game before meeting with Kim and starting her game development career. Next, there are some really interesting additional inspirations for LobCorp. Firstly, Cabin in the Woods. You know, that one. Another inspiration being Warehouse 13. Secondly, 3 games are named to be the approximate progenitors behind LobCorp's gameplay, those being Zoo Tycoon, SimCity 4, and Dungeon Keeper. The elements of those games where you manage a zoo, city, or dungeon, but then you lose control, be that intentional or not, and then everything goes to shit. Yeah, those elements are pretty familiar to anyone who played LobCorp. However, Kim does say that he had to go through a lot of trial and error anyway, and the aforementioned games were only partially influential in his thought process behind the game. When talking about Library of Ruina, Kim originally planned it to be a reverse dungeon crawler, kind of like Dungeon Keeper. The player will have to place librarians around the library to defend against the guests, having them act out roles of mobs who obstruct the adventure party's way. Further parallels are drawn with games like Domina and Football Manager. Eventually though, the idea was scrapped, and our director, while playing Slay the Spire, just decided to make Ruina into a story-heavy RPG with light deck builder elements. Later, the interviewer asks Kim Ji-hoon, "Where did you get most of your inspiration for the story? I heard it was based on Jorge's The Library of Babel." There was some inspiration from Borges' short story collection, but it wasn't my main reference. In fact, I only started reading classics when I was in college. But at the time, I was already so immersed in otaku media that it wasn't particularly stimulating or memorable. I'm not trying to disparage the value of classics, but since I already had other tastes, they didn't give me as much satisfaction as I thought. That's why I didn't use them as my main reference when making games. The story motive was actually a fantasy world I had set up when I was young. I used to imagine my own world and story since I was in elementary school. I didn't plan to make a game with that fantasy from the beginning, but as I started making the game, I got greedy, so my self-created worldview became the prototype of the city. I feel like the worldview is woven quite broadly. I haven't decided on the details yet, but I already planned out the big picture of the setting, the story's important milestones, and the ending. I plan to gradually unfold it. So yeah, the setting, even while having drawn elements and inspiration from such a tremendous amount of media, is still largely a creation of its creator's mind, his experiences and emotions, how the real world treated him and how he views it in return. A mind that had developed around a marvelous collection of masterworks and awaited to be experienced and then reimagined. A mind that, despite the difficulties and setbacks in the real world, was not afraid to commit its imagination to paper. This mind brought experiences that not only made me deeply care about his characters and stories, but also about the people behind them. The group of people that crafted my favorite stories that never failed to bring me to tears. What's the group's name? Well... thank you for watching the video. There are probably many more references that I failed to include here. Here are the total stats of every piece of media that I did find. I will be keeping a Google Doc that will include every single one of them, as well as other additions that I may find in the future, or that will be suggested in the comments. I want to make Project Moon content that not only will be educational, but also entertaining. I'm also open to criticism. Maybe this video was fucking terrible. I won't know unless you tell me, so yeah. Words of encouragement are also appreciated, of course. Well, anyway, here's the part where I again tell you to subscribe and such. You don't have to, but, you know, it would be cool, I guess. Okay, no more technical ring. Bye-bye.